Hello, Warren Fay here with the good old bad old days. I'm going to take you on a walk through time along Darlinghurst Road. Today we're celebrating that unique part of Sydney, King's Cross. I like to think that it's the emotional heart of Sydney. Well, it used to be, and possibly it could still return as such. But let's have a little bit of a walk. Let's start down at Queen's Cross. This was the convergence of all those streets, the ones that led over to Paddington, down William Street to the city, through to Bayswater Road and down to the eastern suburbs, and of course down to Potts Point. King's Cross Road in those days was full of large terraces and shops. They all went for the expressway. But let's have a look around. Well, the sign says Queen's Cross, and it remained that until the death of Queen Victoria in 1901. And they built a memorial statue in Macquarie Street of Queen Vic, and they didn't want confusion, so on her death they changed Queen's Cross to King's Cross. The most significant building when you look around is the fire station. Built in 1911, it was a fire station that also for a while accommodated the police, and upstairs there were rooms for the firemen to sleep when they were off duty or having a nap if you were between fires. It's a significant building. We're lucky that it survives. On the opposite side, on Victoria Street, is the King's Cross Hotel, still there, and next door to that was the Oriental Hotel, which was another hotel but also primarily accommodation. Victoria Street, as we know, was full of grand terraces, thankfully, because of the work of Juanita Nielsen and Jack Mundy and Mick Fowler and a whole lot of locals. Victoria Street was mostly saved from the wrecking ball. What a disaster that would have been if those significant terraces had come tumbling down in the name of progress. Anyway, back up to Darlinghurst Road, looking down Bayswater Road, on the right-hand side was the Mayfair Hotel, which was an Art Deco hotel. It was a significant build, and it was a beautiful hotel, and it's such a shame that it went down for the Kingsgate building. If we look up at the King's Cross centrepiece, the Coca-Cola sign, a bit unfortunate that it's Coca-Cola in my mind, but it's still, I think, the biggest illuminated commercial sign in the Southern Hemisphere, and it's certainly synonymous with King's Cross. I do like how they change it to reflect events like Earth Day and, of course, the Mardi Gras in Sydney. Just turning ahead to the left, or looking down where the Coca-Cola sign is, if in the old days, if you look down, you would have found the Hasty Tasty, a place to get cheap meals, because King's Cross had everything from cheap meals to fine dining. And later on, next to it, was the Pink Pussycat, just one of the many burlesque shows where you could see a woman strip, possibly with a python wrapped around her neck. It was a place of wonder for many people. If you looked up where Minton House is today, you would have seen a very large clock that said Capstan cigarettes, time for a Capstan. And as we know, the trams came hurtling up William Street, and that convergence of King's Cross, Queen's Cross, was extremely busy, especially that changeover period where the trams were coming up and going down to Bayswater road, and down at the bottom of Bayswater was the tram depot, and that included a gigantic winch that wound the cable, bringing the tram up William Street. Of course, it's quite an incline, and then down Bayswater. If one started to walk down Darlinghurst Road, commonly known as the Strip, in the 1870s, you would have found a terrace that went from Minton Place, from the corner, right down 17 or 18 very significant terraces. They were called Alberto Terrace, and they were 3 levels, 4 levels high with a basement, commercial premises along the ground floor, built in the 1870s by a Jewish merchant, and mainly accommodated Jewish people who found it very convenient to be able to walk down William Street to go to the temple down there, the great synagogue. I know that this was a significant terrace because if you stood in Hyde Park and looked up to King's Cross, you could see it from Hyde Park. You could also see it from the bottom of William Street, these Alberto terraces. So people used to come from all over Sydney and probably Australia to look at these grand terraces because there were none elsewhere. These were just huge. Some of the remnants, the elements of that Alberto terrace, which was sold and pulled down in the late 1920s, still remain hidden. Minton House wraps around part of the Alberto terrace remnants. On the opposite side to Alberto Terrace was, in the 1920s, the theatre, the cinema. We called it picture shows in those days. And this 1920s picture show accommodated over 2,000 people to watch the latest films. It was a significant attraction for King's Cross. Opposite the theatre, later, in the 1940s, I think, 1930s, possibly late 30s, Bert's Milk Bar was established. And Bert's Milk Bar was the home of the Sydney Bodgies and Widgies. They had a jukebox, they had a very large counter, and they introduced the American-style milkshakes. Just so happened that Sydney and Australia had a milk glut at the time, so this was very, very welcomed. If you look back again at that theatre over the other side, in the 1930s, the theatre was given a complete makeover, an Art Deco makeover, and it was a fantastic job as well. They also put in a news theaterette, which functioned right throughout the 30s and the 40s during the war to show newsreel. Wandering up on the same side as the theatre towards what's now the Ellermain Fountain, we would have found some significant coffee shops, and in the 1940s and 50s, quite a large number of the European migrants in the area that came out around the First World War and definitely before the rise of the Nazis in the Second World War. We had a lot of European migrants who established coffee shops and cafes and restaurants. I know that I had my first espresso and my first schnitzel in King's Cross, and later on in life I turned the corner and I went to the Rex Hotel and I had my first encounter. So there's lots of memories in the area for me. But anyway, continuing along past some of these significant cafes and restaurants, we would have hit Springfield Avenue, and on that corner was the Kookaburra Cafe. It was a very large cafe, and it also had along the side street the Kookaburra chocolate shop. They used to make their own chocolates on the premises and were quite famous. going back a bit towards the theatre and looking over the road, you would have had Woolworths. Now, the Woolworths that I'm talking about was built by Mr. Christmas, who was the managing director of Woolworths, and he lived in the Macleay Regis, and he built a very large Woolworths store with a very large cafeteria on the first floor. Later on, when Woolworths closed, it became the ABC's recording studio for its orchestras. I know that I did some of my early radio programs for the ABC in that same studio. It's now occupied by the City of Sydney as a neighbourhood centre and, of course, our library. Going up on that same side, we find Rosalind Avenue, Rosalind Street, there that the Piccolo Bar is in. It was famous for many, many years as one of the destinations for Bohemian King's Cross, Bohemian Sydney. It's became an institution, and of course it's wonderful that today it still exists, and it is a very swanky and fantastic little cocktail bar. Just shows you what you can do with a small space that has so many memories you can't obliterate it. Then going a little bit further, which is now the Empire to Bourbon strip that is now been demolished. On the corner, of course, you had the very famous Les Girls, one of several gay and lesbian venues in King's Cross because it suited the bohemian nature of the area. Les Girls was really, it operated for over 25 years and was an institution in its own right. It mainly attracted straight audiences, but did have a gay night on Sunday nights later on in life. A little further on, you would have hit one of the several folk clubs in the 1960s that operated in Sydney, and the one in King's Cross was called the Folk Attic. And I know that I went there in its dying days, but you could go in and get a coffee, but the coffee had brandy in it. It was the period that everything was sort of going underground. And of course, next door was the Bourbon and Beefsteak Bar, run by Bernie Horton, an American who also owned the Texas Tavern. And this was a fabulous place, and I remember after some big nights going there for breakfast, and he had a band playing, and you'd get a Bloody Mary and a big greasy breakfast, and it was heaven. It was a real significant place, the Bourbon and Beefsteak Bar. If you kept going, there were terraces that continued down Darlinghurst Road as it went down, but they were taken down, and as we know, the Memorial El Alamein fountain was built. The whole of that Fitzroy Gardens was built in the late 50s, early 60s, possibly late 50s, I think. And I remember going up there, and there were all sorts of characters, including a man that played this violin that birds used to perch on it. He had his trained birds. He was called the Birdman of King's Cross, and he'd play his instrument and people would come. There were lots of buskers in the area in those days. I remember one girl, she used to have played the guitar, and she had a sign, America or bust, or New York or bust. Anyway, she must have, or Paris or bust it was, she must have got the money because she disappeared. And there were all sorts of fraudsters. There was one story about a couple of shysters who had signs saying, watch the dancing duck, and they'd come around and they'd collect money. They had a duck, and they had a big paint tin, and they said, watch the dancing duck, and people would all pay their money, and the duck would, on the paint tin, would go and dance. What they didn't realise is that there was a candle inside the tin, and the flame was making the tin hot, and the duck had to keep moving its feet to keep from burning itself. Once you got up to the end where the El Alamein fountain is, prior to that, it was Manamora, a big big house as featured in Aunts Up the Cross, that fabulous book on the eccentrics of King's Cross. And then you turn left into what became known as the Paris end of King's Cross. That's Macleay Street starting, where you had the Chelsea restaurant, and you had so many coffee shops and nightclubs that went down through Macleay Street and Potts Point. The Cross is really this area that was significant in Sydney's story because it was really the only place opened after 9:30. And if you wanted a meal, it was the only place that you could go. If you wanted alcohol in the 1950s, early 60s with your meal, you had to order it by 5 o'clock. Otherwise, you couldn't have it. The hotels, the Rex was built in the early 60s, and as we know, the Chevron Hilton was built. The Rex Hotel had the first drive-in bottle shop in New South Wales, and it was the first time people could take home multiple drinks that they'd purchased. So much changed in the area. It became a place for music, particularly rock and roll in some of those places around the Cross, and then eventually they disappeared and were replaced by DJ music. And then we know the lockouts came down and ripped out what was left of the Cross. We know that during World War II, the Cross was heaving. It wasn't unusual on New Year's Eve to have 100,000 people on the streets of King's Cross partying to bring in the new year. And looking through the newspaper reports for, who was stabbed, who was given a king hit, nobody. They were peaceful. They were all peaceful. It was only when the Vietnam War came and all those people on R&R that they bought heroin and hard drugs, and the place just became a sleaze pit. And then prior to the lockouts, we realised it had become a zoo because 20,000 people roaming the area couldn't get into clubs, couldn't get home on transport. There were all sorts of social problems. We didn't want the zoo back, but we do want the life of the area back. Darlinghurst Road today, it's sad. I've never seen so many empty shops. It's a mess. It needs some vision to bring it back to life. It needs a plan. It needs a little bit of tender love and care to bring it back to what we know as the King's Cross that Sydney deserves.